On August 17, 1887, in the quiet town of St. Anne's Bay, 50 years after emancipation, the son of a Maroon was born, one who refused to accept the injustices he observed around him as he grew up. While attending school, he developed a healthy appetite for reading, fed by his small library at home. Unable to attend high school because of financial difficulties, Garvey, at age 14, became an apprentice printer for his godfather, Mr. Burroughs. 2 years later, he joined the staff of P.A. Benjamin in Kingston as a printer and quickly became a foreman. But after having joined a workers' strike at the plant, he was relieved of his job. After a brief stint at the government's printing office, he started his own paper, The Watchman. It folded because of poor financing. At an early age, Garvey began championing the cause of black redemption, leading the way for the universal freedom of the black diaspora. He became actively involved in politics, cultural organization, and the trade union movement, and developed a passion for journalism, printing, and publishing. At the age of 20, Garvey made a life-changing commitment.
I asked myself, where is the black man's government? Where is his king and his kingdom? Where is his president, his country, and ambassadors, his army, his men of big affairs?
Garvey could not find the answer, and so took on the task of helping blacks at home and abroad to create their own nation. In 1910, he joined his uncle in Costa Rica and traveled extensively throughout South and Central America, where he observed and was deeply touched by the poor conditions in which West Indian workers lived. Later, he traveled to England and continued his studies in journalism. While there, he consolidated the thoughts and philosophy that he would use to call the Negroes of the world to action. At the age of 27, 5 days after he returned from England, Mosiah Garvey founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities Imperial League. The focus of the organization was to unite all the black peoples of the world and to establish a country and government that was absolutely and uniquely their own. Garvey's movement ran into trouble with the local authorities and was rejected by the Jamaican people. Undaunted, he traveled to the United States. After visiting several states, he settled in New York. From there, Garvey established several branches of the UNIA across the country, and by 1920, the movement registered over 4 million members. At its peak, the UNIA had over 11 million registered members in 859 branches in over 30 countries. On June 27, 1919, the economic arm of Garvey's liberation movement was incorporated, the Black Star Line. This enterprise was meant to create jobs and business opportunities for millions of blacks worldwide. The business did well in the first year, but ran into financial difficulties soon afterwards. Garvey, his movement, and his philosophy ran into problems with the United States authorities. He was jailed and deported to Jamaica. Garvey returned to Jamaica to a tumultuous welcome by a large and enthusiastic crowd. He wasted no time in organizing a political movement. He founded the People's Political Party in 1929, the first modern political party in Jamaica. Perhaps Garvey's most outstanding contribution in the quest for the universal emancipation of the black race was his lifelong, unrelenting efforts to unite and uplift the black race through a program of self-reliance and education. The thoughts and ideas of Marcus Garvey evolved into a social, political, spiritual, and economic blueprint for the successful development of a black nation. He advocated Africa for the Africans. He encouraged blacks to be proud of themselves and of their history, and for them to be self-reliant and strong. In shaping the political destiny of the black nation, the Declaration of the Rights of the Negro Peoples of the World adopted at the first International Convention of Negro Peoples held during the month of August 1920 in New York, was a radical document. As a legal instrument, it ranked alongside the Magna Carta and the United States Constitution in that it affirmed and demanded redress for the injustices heaped upon a despised and rejected people by the entire world. The convention was attended by over 25,000 members and delegates from all over the world and demonstrated the power and reach of Garvey's movement. But most of all, it signaled the growing solidarity of the Negro peoples of the world. Garvey called for the emancipation of the mind at the 6th Negro Convention in 1929, held at Edelweiss Park in Kingston. He declared then that after the physical emancipation of slaves, the UNIA should create a second emancipation, an emancipation of the minds and thoughts of the 400 million Negroes of the world. Marcus Mosiah Garvey was not able to totally emancipate his people from their social, economic, and political bonds in his lifetime, but he certainly planted the seeds of black liberation and redemption across the globe, and the world has not been the same since.
Marcus Garvey words come to pass.
He was a commanding figure, a ruggedly handsome and stylish gentleman who was very sure of himself. He was born William Alexander Clark in Blenheim, Hanover in 1884. At age 20, he did what was typical of many middle-class Jamaicans like himself, migrate to make a life abroad. For the next 30 years, his adventurous spirit took him to several countries, including Panama, the United States, and Cuba. And during his travels, he changed his name from William Alexander Clark to Alexander Bustamante. In Cuba, the seeds of what later became his lifelong passion were planted, as he watched Cuban workers agitate for better working conditions. Upon his return home in 1934, at age 50, Bustamante set up his business in downtown Kingston. This brought him in daily contact with the woe and misery of the Jamaican people. He bombarded the Gleaner, the island's main newspaper, with letters about the plight of Jamaican workers. These letters were regarded as hostile and earned him some unsavory labels such as pest, communist, and usurper. Around September 1937, Bustamante seemed to have taken the decision to be the voice of change for the Jamaican worker. He took his campaign to the street corners and homes all over the island. From Westmoreland to Kingston, Bustamante drummed up support, encouraging workers to protest for better working conditions. He was affectionately called Buster or Chief, the champion in the struggle for workers' rights. Those whom he represented stretched from the sugar fields in the west to the docks of Kingston and to the banana fields in the east. And Jamaicans embraced him wholeheartedly. Buster's determination to represent the workers made him a thorn in the side of the colonial authorities. His now famous battle cry, "Shoot me, but let my people go," made him a hero in the eyes of those he represented. The workers' confidence in him translated into mass support for the Bustamante Industrial Trade Union, which he formed in May 1938. In no time, it was a tremendous success. The support also spilled over into the Jamaica Labour Party, which Buster formed in 1943 to compete in the 1944 election, the year of universal adult suffrage. Buster's success in the election carried over to the next election, and he won a second term in office in 1949. He became Jamaica's first chief minister and started the work to get Jamaica to become a part of the British West Indian Federation. Jamaica became a member in 1958 during the term of office of the other political party, the People's National Party. However, Buster later changed his mind about Jamaica being a part of the Federation, as he felt that it would drain Jamaica's resources to help the other British territories. Buster again took up the role of the defender of the Jamaican people, who backed him when they voted by a referendum to withdraw Jamaica from the Federation and start Jamaica's move towards independence. His political first came again when the JLP won the 1962 election, and at age 78, Bustamante was named the first Prime Minister of an independent Jamaica. 2 years later, due to illness, he left the political scene and in 1967 retired from public life. The nation's highest honor, National Hero, was conferred upon Alexander Bustamante in 1967. Here again, he created history, being the only person to have received this honor while still alive. Bustamante lived for 10 years after, basking in the rewards of his labor. Today, there are numerous monuments that honor his memory and the part he played in the history of this nation. Alexander Bustamante died on August 6, 1977, 15 years to the day that he stood proudly to witness his ultimate success for the Jamaican people, independence.
Norman Washington Manley's contribution to national development began in earnest when he returned to Jamaica after having completed his studies in England in 1922. He was a barrister whose prowess in the criminal courts, civil and appeal courts laid the foundation for what was to be his life's work in Jamaica's political arena. His path to politics started with his advocacy on behalf of the country's banana growers, who wanted to establish a banana shipping company. The Boston-based United Fruit Company, at the time the dominant force in the Jamaica export trade, was, however, stiffly opposed to this, and it was Norman Manley's skillful negotiation that brought an end to the impasse which had developed. His work resulted in the export company setting aside 1 cent per stem of banana exported from Jamaica to form a fund, the proceeds of which would go toward the welfare of the Jamaican people. Norman Manley was chairman of that company for 10 years. He recruited volunteers who would work through community projects and cottage industries to change the quality of life of the Jamaican masses. Norman Manley had recognized the importance of economic and social advancement to the further development of the people. He wanted them to have a better quality of life and greater access to basic amenities. With such deep concern for the conditions of the poor, it is not surprising that he was catapulted into active political life by the events of 1938. Jamaica was going through a tumultuous period with the impending turn from colonial to self-rule. Industrial strikes broke out across the island. From Frome in Westmoreland to Kingston, dock workers were up in arms.
The most remarkable, spontaneous movement. It was just a rebellion against hard conditions. And by midday, the city was like a graveyard. But I remember next day, I toured the city. Nothing but sullen crowds at street corners, policemen, soldiers, guns, bayonets. And I wondered what was going to happen.
Resulting from the upheaval, Norman's cousin Alexander Bustamante, who was recognized as the labor leader, was arrested. He asked Norman to represent the striking workers who were determined not to return to work until Bustamante was released. Norman was heading for the political arena.
And that night I made up my mind. And I put an advertisement in the leading newspaper of Jamaica that I would represent all the striking groups in the country.
Norman's skill as a negotiator held him in good stead as the striking workers calmed and Bustamante was released. One issue which he set out to address was that of the voting franchise for the Jamaican masses. He was among those who helped to wring from a reluctant Britain full adult suffrage in 1944. But Manley wanted more for Jamaica. He wanted Jamaica to have full control over its internal affairs. The stopgap British Constitution, which had been instituted in 1944, had given the colonial government executive powers, so Norman Manley became deeply involved in the fight for a new constitution. This was realized in 1954 and firmly established the ministerial responsibility of elected representatives of the people. Norman Washington Manley strove for self-government in a climate largely hostile to the idea. He set out to restructure the consciousness of the Jamaican people, to attain full adult suffrage and construct a new constitution. After having given exemplary service to his country, Norman Washington Manley retired from politics in July of 1969. He died in September of that same year at 76, and thereafter was declared a national hero.
It was Christmas time in 1831, and Samuel Sharp, an educated Creole slave and a deacon at the Burchell Baptist Church in Montego Bay, was fine-tuning the plans for the first sit-down labor strike in Jamaica. The plan was to have an all-island sit-down strike by slaves at the end of the 3-day Christmas holidays between December 25 and December 27. It was the ideal time, as the sugarcane crop would be ready for harvesting by then, and if it wasn't reaped quickly, the crop would spoil. To lose a whole crop of cane spelled certain economic disaster for the island, which depended heavily on sugar as the main income earner. Sam Sharp believed that the planters would be compelled to negotiate freedom and salaries for the slaves returned to work. The plan of passive resistance didn't work. On December 27, the Kensington Estate Great House was set on fire. It was felt that several slaves, drunk from the lavish distribution of rum during the merry season, started the fires. The destruction and the terrible loss of lives on that day and ensuing months have gone down in the pages of history as the Christmas Rebellion. Sam Sharp's freedom campaign never turned out the way he planned. He gave himself up to the authorities in a bid to end the slave killings and accepted responsibility for the rebellion, even though a number of actions were taken that did not meet with his approval. He was found guilty of inciting rebellion and administering unlawful oaths. Daddy Sharp, as his followers affectionately called him, is now seen as the predecessor of the trade union movement, as he fought for the labor rights of slaves. Sam Sharp's life holds many valuable lessons for Jamaicans today. Although born in poverty, regarded as nothing more than an inanimate object by society, he taught himself to read, argued constructively, and presented himself always as a man of honor. This man of remarkable intellect, courage, and physical and moral authority succeeded in imparting his vision to more than 20,000 slaves in 5 parishes, instilling in them the desire to fight for the freedom so many of us enjoy today. It was his selflessness which propelled Sam Sharp to hero status in 1975. The year was 1865. The former slaves had been emancipated 27 years prior to that date. But freedom, a long-awaited dream for those who had toiled long and hard under the master's whip, remained just that, a dream. Times were hard, the workers were impoverished, wages were extremely low, and there was little scope for educational advancement. Peasant farmers were unable to procure land. In fact, the way land was distributed showed up the irregularities of the legal system. The hard times were further complicated by a prolonged drought in the early 1860s and the American Civil War, which cut off supplies from the United States led to a food shortage. Added to this boiling stew of discontent was a lack of public confidence in the government. In these troubled times, Paul Bogle, a Baptist deacon, emerged as a leader among his people. He has been described as a man who had a social conscience, high morals, and determination. Born in 1822 in Stony Gut, an area a few miles north of Morant Bay in St. Thomas, Paul Bogle had great influence and was greatly respected in his district. Although he had very little formal education, he was a successful small farmer. But he shared with his friend George William Gordon a concern for the plight of the people and was driven to protest for social and political reforms. This concern led him to form a committee to take the grievances of the people of Morant Bay to the Governor John Eyre, and so, on the morning of August 12, 1865, Bogle and his delegation walked the 45 miles from Stony Gut to Spanish Town. But their efforts were in vain, as Governor Eyre refused to grant them audience. Disappointed, enraged, tired, and discouraged, Bogle and his followers trudged back to Stony Gut. Despite the encouragement of his friend George William Gordon to send a deputation to England, Bogle decided to use his own methods. He held secret meetings in the hills, drilling a number of his followers to form a small army, and on October 11, Bogle and about 300 followers marched on Morant Bay. After sacking the police station, the angry crowd moved to the courthouse, where they were fired upon by the militia. In the ensuing battle, the courthouse and several other buildings were burnt, and a number of persons from both sides of the conflict were killed. The governor declared martial law on October 13, and hundreds of protesters were flogged, shot, or hanged. Bogle tried to organize his forces to resist the militia, to no avail. On October 23, he was captured by a party of Maroons and brought to Morant Bay for trial. He was hanged the next day. The actions of Paul Bogle and his followers had a number of consequences. The whites feared that the Morant Bay Rebellion could turn into a race war. They also feared that with the black majority being able to vote and becoming more and more qualified, the House of Assembly would eventually be dominated by blacks and browns. The rebellion also raised the issue of policing the Jamaican countryside. The Crown also became more involved in the running of Jamaica and implemented several measures to deal with the existing poverty and hardships in the country. The St. Catherine irrigation system was one of the immediate outcomes, and more organizations were set up to deal with the conditions of poverty. In the early 1800s, the wealthy Scottish planter Joseph Gordon owned a large sugar estate in the parish of St. Andrew and lived in a beautiful Georgian great house on its grounds. In 1820, Joseph Gordon fathered a son with a slave woman. He was named George William Gordon. George William was not born a slave, although he was born before emancipation. He spent most of his childhood in the house set up by his father for his children born of this slave woman. From an early age, George William's father noticed his keen interest in books and encouraged him to study. The young Gordon was also a great orator and took part in religious debates at an early age. Gordon's commitment to religion never waned. He started an independent Baptist organization and erected a tabernacle in Kingston where he often preached. Gordon helped his followers to open chapels in many parts of the island and also ordained several deacons, including Paul Bogle of Stony Gut. In later years, this educated gentleman became a successful businessman. He concentrated on buying and leasing lands, which he cut up and sold or sublet cheaply to the Negro peasants, who at the time had great difficulty obtaining land. He also sold them livestock and organized a marketing system through which they could sell their produce at fair prices. Emancipation was not a welcome change for most of the planter class in Jamaica, and many tried by various means to hinder the progress of blacks. Gordon was a member of the wealthy middle class who did his best to help the free slaves. When he entered politics, he used this medium to speak out frequently about the unjust treatment of this group. By 1865, the social and economic crisis in Jamaica had reached a dangerous level. The harshness and insensitivity of the then Governor Edward Eyre did nothing to relieve the tension. Gordon was outraged by the conditions he saw. Although he wanted to see a change in the social and material conditions of the blacks, he never advocated violence as a means of achieving this change. As a member of the Jamaican Assembly, he spoke out on behalf of the poor Negroes and bitterly criticized Governor Eyre. It was therefore ironic that he was blamed for instigating and supporting the Morant Bay Rebellion in St. Thomas. Despite the lack of evidence, Governor Eyre issued a warrant for his arrest. On hearing this, George William Gordon gave himself up to the authorities and was quickly taken to Morant Bay, where he was illegally tried and sentenced to death. Gordon was hanged with 18 other persons on October 23, 1865. The residential area, now known as Cherry Gardens, is the former estate where George William Gordon was born.
Wherever there has been slavery, there has been resistance and marronage, the act of slaves running away from plantations to set up free societies outside the area of oppression. The Jamaican Maroons today remain an important symbol of resistance and the desire for freedom. Their origins date back to 1655, when the British captured Jamaica from the Spaniards. With the arrival of the British, the slaves brought here by the Spaniards escaped from the plantations. They took to the hills, where they established themselves apart from the new rulers of the island. During their settlement of the island, the British brought more slaves from Africa to work on the sugar plantations. Some of these slaves also ran away to the hills and joined the original Maroons, thereby increasing their numbers. Nanny was part of this militant tradition of runaway black slaves. Not long after arriving in Jamaica, she and her 5 brothers escaped from the estate on which they were placed. They chose to live in different parts of the island. Of the 6, Nanny and Kwao went to Portland, Kojo went to St. James, and Akompong went to St. Elizabeth. Interestingly enough, they all became leaders of the Maroons in each of these areas, with Nanny being made leader of the Blue Mountain rebel town, later renamed Nanny Town. Nanny and her people kept close watch over the settlement, warding off numerous attacks by the British. The Maroons had escaped, but many more Africans were in captivity. Nanny hated the severe cruelty that was being meted out to them, particularly the female slaves and their children, so she and other Maroons repeatedly raided the estates, often setting free the slaves and taking food and weapons. Nanny was a fierce warrior, a military leader. Her skill in planning warfare came to be widely known and respected even by the British. For over 50 years, she led over 800 Maroons through many battles with the enemy. While Nanny's brother Kojo made peace with the British by signing a peace treaty in 1739, Nanny refused to sign one. She would only agree to a truce. Nanny died sometime in the 1750s and was laid to rest at Bump Grave in Maroon Town. In 1975, the UN declared Year of the Woman. She was declared a national heroine. While history records stories of other women who fought the British as fiercely as Nanny did, there is no other more outstanding, more revered than Nanny of the Maroons.